Imagine a version of Terra where the greatest secret project in human history never existed. No hidden corridors beneath the Imperial Palace, no vast psychic gateway waiting to be unlocked, and no plan to escape the nightmare tides of the warp. In this alternate timeline, the Imperial Webway is not abandoned. It simply never begins. And without it, the Unification Wars transform into something far darker, far longer, and far more unpredictable. In this scenario, every victory becomes fragile, every strategy becomes desperate, and the future of humanity hangs on decisions made under pressure rather than prophecy. This is not a galaxy where a perfect plan is interrupted. This is a galaxy where the plan itself was never conceived, and because of that single omission, the entire chain of events leading to the rise of the Imperium begins to twist into a new shape. So let's open the chronicle of a Terra that forged unity without relying on a hidden escape from the warp. Without the Imperial Webway Project, the foundation of early imperial strategy collapses into a harsher reality. Terra must expand across a galaxy corrupted by warp storms, with no hope of building a safe, permanent corridor beyond them. Instead of preparing for a future of stable travel, humanity becomes trapped in a cycle of constant defensive innovation. Every psyker outbreak, every demonic incursion, and every anomalous warp event becomes a threat that must be contained manually, often through brutal force. The early Imperium channels its scientific focus into stabilizing human genetics, controlling psychic volatility, and building increasingly resilient armies capable of resisting corruption. Where the original timeline had a sense of long-term planning, this version of humanity is reactive, constantly patching cracks in reality rather than paving over them. Innovation becomes a necessity, not ambition. The Unification Wars themselves transform dramatically. On a Terra that cannot dream of a future webway, conquest takes longer and burns hotter. Thunder Warriors are deployed for extended campaigns, not rapid strikes, and their instability becomes a dangerous liability. Successor iterations of genetic soldiers appear earlier, but without the stabilizing influence of long-term psychic infrastructure. Each generation is forced to rely on physical enhancement over psychic potential. The factories of Terra shift toward mass industrialization rather than elegant technological evolution. Cities grow not as centers of culture, but as fortress districts, each capable of resisting hostile psykers or warp anomalies. The leaders of Old Earth fall not to diplomacy or long preparation, but to overwhelming force, siege warfare, and relentless momentum. Instead of a rising empire preparing for a brighter destiny, Terra becomes a fortress forging unity through necessity. Most importantly, the absence of the Webway changes the very heart of imperial scientific development. The Golden Throne, instead of becoming a stabilizing gatekeeper or psychic engine, never becomes the same machine. It may still be created, but as a different kind of weapon. In this timeline, it evolves into a warp suppression device, a colossal anti-immaterium engine, built to counter the storms raging across the galaxy. Its function becomes containment, not expansion. And because there is no catastrophic failure during a Webway experiment, there is no moment where the Emperor is forced into a life or death sacrifice. He remains fully active, fully mobile, and fully involved in shaping every stage of humanity's rise. The Imperium, therefore, does not revolve around a silent figure bound to a machine. It revolves around a living leader directing events personally. The Primarch Project also unfolds along a new trajectory. Without the Webway Project consuming attention, their development receives closer oversight. Their genetic matrices are refined with a focus on battlefield reliability rather than psychic flexibility. As a result, several Primarchs emerge with more grounded personalities, less reliant on intuitive foresight, more focused on tactical execution. Magnus, lacking the same psychic expectations placed upon him, grows into a powerful strategist rather than a flawed prodigy. Horus receives more consistent mentorship, reducing the emotional vulnerabilities that once opened the door to corruption. Even Lorgar, without a dramatic spiritual confrontation with a silent emperor, develops into a disciplined leader shaped by structure, not crisis. The Primarchs remain extraordinary, but their destinies no longer hinge on a single catastrophic project. The Great Crusade proceeds under drastically different conditions. With no stable Webway alternative, every fleet must navigate the warp directly, accepting unpredictable risks with each jump. Exploration becomes slower, supply lines become unstable, and the early crusade relies heavily on fortified staging points rather than sweeping galactic pushes. Legion fleets operate under strict psychic protocols, with navigators and psychers subjected to constant monitoring. Each newly rediscovered human world becomes a strategic outpost, rather than a stepping stone to a grander design. The Imperium expands steadily but cautiously, resembling a chain of armored bastions rather than a wave of exploration. This slower, more calculated pace prevents overextension, but also means humanity's rise is met with heavier resistance from already present galactic powers. Chaos, ironically, appears earlier and more aggressively. Without the stabilizing effects of the planned Webway expansion, warp storms intensify with fewer barriers. Legion fleets encounter corrupted entities more frequently, and psychers experience unpredictable fluctuations. However, the presence of an active central leader mitigates these dangers. Instead of reacting too late or through indirect command, the Emperor coordinates rapid countermeasures. Anti-warp technology advances faster. Proto-Grey Knight units appear earlier. Imperial science leans toward suppression fields, anti-immaterium armor, and devices that disrupt possession attempts. Chaos becomes a stronger adversary, but the Imperium becomes a sharper blade in response. The galactic conflict becomes a visible, tangible rivalry rather than a covert spiritual battle. One of the most dramatic divergences appears during what would have been the Horus Heresy. The original chain of events, Webway catastrophe, mistrust, isolation, psychic betrayal, never take shape. Without that underlying tension, the seeds of rebellion either never sprout or emerge in entirely new soil. If a civil war does erupt, it happens for reasons far removed from wounded pride or psychic miscommunication. It may begin as a conflict over strategic philosophy, industrial control, or the increasingly strained partnership between Terra and Mars. The Mechanicum, no longer impressed by a lost Webway vision, asserts greater independence, sometimes verging on open defiance. Any large-scale rebellion therefore becomes more political, more industrial, and more focused on control of technology rather than personal betrayal. In the long-term future of this alternate timeline, humanity becomes a slower but far more stable power. Its territories are fewer but more defensible, its armies smaller but more precise, and its leaders more interconnected. The absence of a single catastrophic event means there is no sudden plunge into darkness, no millennia-long stagnation under a silent ruler. Instead, innovation continues, albeit cautiously. The Imperium becomes a galaxy-spanning fortress network rather than a vast empire rotting under its own size. Worlds are bound by mutual defense pacts, standardized technology, and a leadership structure that evolves rather than calcifies. It is not a utopia, but it is undeniably more functional than the grim nightmare of the original timeline. So, what does a galaxy without the Imperial Webway truly look like? Not brighter, not darker, just profoundly different. Humanity becomes a civilization defined not by lost potential, but by adaptive resilience. Every victory is earned, not inherited. Every advancement is built on necessity, not on secret architectures beneath a palace. And every chapter of history is written by a leader who remains present instead of becoming a silent myth. In this version of the Warhammer universe, the greatest change is not technological, it is psychological. Humanity does not chase a perfect future, it survives the present with sharpened resolve. And perhaps, in a galaxy filled with threats both seen and unseen. That shift alone is enough to redefine destiny.